Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that will have you coming back for more. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get to the main event, just a reminder for those who are on YouTube, please hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. If you're listening from Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other audio platforms, be sure to subscribe there as well. We also accept donations for those who want to help us continue to build this great platform. We do take donations through Cash App using the handle $IDTALK4ED or Venmo with the handle @Kwame SM, or using PayPal where you can type in the URL paypal.me/Kwame SM. And for my day ones, for those who have been with the community from day one and you know what Identity Talk is about, if you want to make a more long-term commitment to building this platform and donating, you can go on Patreon and become a patron today. That will give you access to early videos. That will give you access to behind the scenes footage of what Identity Talk is about. So if you're all about that content that is not going to be seen by the greater public, become a patron today and continue to support this platform. And then we have Learning to Relearn, Supporting Identity in the Culture Affirming Classroom. This book will be out in about 2 weeks now. We're 2 weeks out from the release of this book, and man, I couldn't be more excited. I'm a little jealous that some people are already getting a feel and touch for this book, and I gotta wait until I get to the States in order to get my copy of my own book. But that's neither here nor there. What's most important is the energy has been astounding, and people are excited about what's inside this book. As I've mentioned in previous episodes over the past few months, this is 3 years in the making, and for it to finally be almost here, it's just surreal. And I couldn't thank you all enough. Those who have already pre-ordered copies, those who already have their copies in hand, the contributors, the reviewers, thank you so much for supporting this project. This was a passionate one for me. This was something that was personal. So to see that energy and to see people as excited about how transformative this book can be in schools as I am, that's the greatest award you can get as an author. So thank you. And listen, if you don't have your copy already, go to the website, learningtorelearn.com. You'll be able to see the chapter overviews. You'll be able to get access to resources, podcast recommendations, book recommendations, as well as some worksheets that you can use for your practice in your classroom. It's all there, y'all. So make sure y'all go ahead and get you a copy. All right, that's all I need to share with that. Now let's get to the actual show. So I am so excited to have today's guest come on. This is going to be her very first podcast. So I want to say over the past couple of weeks, we've had a couple of first timers come on and they've been amazing. So I expect today's episode to be just as amazing as the previous ones. And listen, here it's all about sharing stories. And she has a story that I know emphatically is going to impact you all who are watching or listening today. So without further ado, I want to bring on my good friend Iyabo Tinubu to the podcast to talk about her life, her work in education, and what she's doing right now. So let's bring Iyabo on so she can share. Hello.
Oh my God, what a welcome.
Yeah, that's the energy we on right now. How are you feeling?
I am loving it. Thank you so much for having me on here.
All right. The only thing that I ask of you is to bring that same energy and to just share your story unapologetically. This is what this platform's about, and this is why you are here. So welcome again.
Thank you, Kwame. Thank you. I am super excited about your book. I'm also having to wait until December before I get my copy when I get back to the UK.
Yeah, so it's going to take a little bit, but once it gets here,
I'm
It'll
super
be
excited.
yours forever.
Yeah.
It'll be yours. So
And
that's the most
I need an autograph, obviously.
yeah, for sure. All right, Iyabo. So let's start from the beginning. So, like me, West African connection, me being Ghanaian, you being Nigerian, but we didn't grow up in our respective countries. We grew up in the western part of the world. So, me being in the States, you growing up in London. Just talk to me about your upbringing and what it was like in those early years growing up in the UK.
For me, it was always like a mix of my identities kind of like merged together, because at home it was very much you know, my mum spoke Yoruba to us when we were at home, and then you know, we go out and we go into school and we had to assimilate. And for the most part of my education, I had I didn't have teachers who looked like me. And so for the longest time, I did feel a lot of a disconnect, because like my identity was mostly affirmed when I was at home with my family. And for me, like I had a transformative year when I was in year 5 in primary school, and I had my first Black teacher, Mr. Morgan, who was this tall Black man from the Caribbean, and he probably wasn't even that tall, but I was I was an 8-year-old, so everyone was tall.
Relative, it's all relative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he brought so much richness to our learning, and by incorporating music, by sharing cultures around the world. Um, we used to play the steel band all the time. We learned about folk tales from around the world. So for the first time, I finally started to see myself reflected in what I was learning beyond stories of struggle, like when we read about when we read The Road to Joburg, which is a powerful book about courage and family and resilience. But when everything that people like me, students like me, explore is about struggle and hardship, you start to believe that your identity and your history is solely tied to adversity and challenges. And it reinforces the danger of a single story, not only for myself, but also the rest of the class.
For sure. And growing up in the UK and going through school, you mentioned a little bit about having that first Black teacher. Well, I want to go deeper with your
Mm,
schooling. So
mm.
tell me, if any, some of the challenges that you may have had as you were trying to be yourself in that setting, because you mentioned that you could only really do that at home. That's where you got
Mm,
that affirmation. But in
100%.
school, it was a totally different story. So talk to me more about that experience throughout your primary and secondary years.
The thing was, like, growing up, I felt it wasn't easy to embrace my African heritage fully. Back in the 90s, like being Africa wasn't even cool back then in the environment that we were socialized in, right? But I'm truly grateful that despite those influences back in those days, I've grown to appreciate and celebrate my identity. Because for me, back in those days, I was bullied quite a lot in school. I was
Mm.
bullied for my name. Kids would call me just horrible variation, not so nice variation of my name. I would be bullied because of the color of my skin, and even for my nose. And like, you know, in the 90s, the Flintstones was really popular back in those days. And so I had like people calling me Yabba Dabba Doo. And I'd go home and my family would like reinforce the fact that my name is beautiful and it has such strong meaning. And I was named after my grandma, who was an incredible human, and looked after the whole family, and that it was an honor to have this name. But then I'd go into school and then it would be a different story in school. So there was always like a kind of struggle between those two things, you know. But always I was affirmed by the reminder that I came from greatness, I am greatness, even if that didn't always marry up with some of the experiences I had in school.
So at what point in your schooling did all the affirmations that you gained from home fully counteract the negative forces that you were receiving in school?
Honestly, like I'd say it didn't even come till university, and that was a more intentional thing for myself. I went to a university where there was a huge diaspora from the African continent. There was just we had loads of students from everywhere. And finally, I was spending more time with people that look like me, people that affirmed me in like my experiences, like were okay about the way I speak, okay about the way I dress, like, you know, everything about me was fine. And then I could intentionally also choose subjects that I could also find myself in as well. So I think it came late teenage years, but it was more from me than like my education or the teachers in my school environment helping me do.
So as you are going through that, I need you to tell me, at what point did you think or believe that being a teacher was possible? Or was that an aspiration that you always had from the time you were born? Tell me about how teaching came into your life.
As a kid, I did not want to be a teacher. Like my majority of my family is in civil service. So I wanted to go into civil service like everybody else. I was in university, and at the time we had a shortage of teachers in the UK, and we had this call for teachers. They had the motto, those who can teach. And I was like, I can. And so they had like some opportunities where as part of our university CAS points, we go into schools and we shadow and we spend time in schools. And I really enjoyed it. And some of the things that I saw were my experiences still happening to kids like 10 years after I was in primary school, and just that need to make a difference in these spaces and for those kids to see someone that looks like me in these spaces. In the school that I went to, that I was volunteering at, there was just a shortage of BIPOC in there. And so during that time, it came into light that that's the direction I wanted to go into. Unfortunately, it wasn't that easy for me to get into that. And I actually went into the civil service for 8 years before I became a teacher. But when the opportunity finally came, I took it, and that was my road to education, to becoming an educator.
And how did those years in civil service translate to the work that you ultimately did in the classroom?
I think it helped me build. It was more about like working with different type of people, being flexible in my thinking. It really built my confidence. One of my role as a civil servant was I worked in a tribunal where I had to announce cases. And if anyone knows me, they know that I have, I'm a firm believer of the mantra, feel the fear and do it anyway. I'm not a lover of presentation, which is hilarious because I do many presentations. And
What you doing right now, though?
I know, it's hilarious. People are like, we would never think that of you, but it's feel the fear and you do it anyway. And so that's one of the things that like I felt like I had to build confidence in, because for all the cases that I managed, I had to introduce those cases in the courtroom. And I remember the first time I did it, I mixed up the applicant and the defendant, and it was for me, it was the worst thing ever. The judge laughed it off, and it was fine. But like, I think experiences like that also remind me that, you know, we all make mistakes, and you know, there can be hiccups, and you move on. And so those little things, working with different people, being flexible, like feeling the fear and doing it anyway, those kind of things I really bring into the spaces that I'm in. I lead assemblies with like hundreds of kids and adults in there, and I'm nervous, and I remind myself that, you know, I need to feel this fear, and I do it anyway. And also, you know, my voice matters. This time that I have in front of people, it matters. The message that I have to share it matters, and you know, those things give me the courage to do those kind of roles that sometimes I fear.
So you started your teaching career in London, but
Mhm.
then after a few years, you decided, all right, I need to get out of my hometown and experience the world.
Yeah.
So how did you catch the bug for international teaching?
It was so I'd been working in a London school for a little while and really enjoying my experience. However, I found that teaching in state schools in the UK it's rough. Like, you know, I was working 7 to 7. There was no work-life balance. I was taking work home, still marking on the bus. You know, I would leave in the pitch dark, get home in the pitch dark. And sometimes, you know, this, you know, like, and, you know, as much as I loved the kids and loved the community I was given to, I also had to think about myself. And I had a thirst to travel. I had a thirst to also improve myself and do better. And so in 2016, I made the decision to go abroad. I saw a few people that had been on my teacher practice that were abroad and sharing their experiences, and I thought I could do this. And initially, I wanted to go to the UAE. And joined an agency, and they were like, no, like China's like up and coming, you need to go to China. And you know, I interviewed, and I thought it was going to take me a very long time. I didn't think, you know, 2 weeks later I would have a job and I would be going straight to China. But that's what happened. And that August, yeah, I got my first placement at a school in Beijing. And that was my first international placement, and it was a shock to the system. I'm not going to lie, it was, but I was very fortunate because it was also a promotion. So I was year lead at this school, but it was a very big move for me at the time.
So I had Dr. Darnell Fine on the show, and he mentioned the fact that when he moved from New York to London for his first teaching gig internationally, it was his first time being abroad. He had never
Yeah,
left the States. So I'm wondering, was this your first time being abroad? I'm
it
sure
wasn't
you had been
my
in,
first.
I'm sure you've been in
It was,
Nigeria,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
outside Nigeria, have you been anywhere else?
So it wasn't my first time being, I had been on holiday, but going on holiday is different to moving from your home country
Mm,
and live and moving to a country that's completely different to where you're used to living. And, you know, there's a lot of misconceptions about China and Beijing. And I also came with some of those misconceptions, and having landed and just seeing, yes, there was a difference, but also I was welcomed really amazingly by the community, by the school. You know, like even that first drop off, we were picked up at the airport. They brought us to our apartment. You know, they had food in the house for us. They checked in on us. And there was just so many things around trying to welcome us to the host country. But yeah, like I remember the first night going to a restaurant and realizing I didn't speak any Mandarin. And, you know, Chinese restaurants in Beijing are not similar to Chinese restaurants in London, and just not able to order for myself that night. So there was like, it was definitely one of those moments where you realize, you know, it was almost like going to college again. It was going to university again, but in a completely different country where they didn't speak the language that I spoke, where I was a minority as well, and where in most cases they hadn't seen someone that looked like me. And so that was a huge shock for me, especially coming from, you know, Hackney in East London, where it's super diverse, super multicultural. Like
mm.
it doesn't faze people to see me. And one of the experiences that I had was someone being super shocked to see a Black person. But equally, I've had really positive experiences where people have celebrated having me here, wanting to hear my perspective, hear my background, and wanting to know how I can contribute to different spaces. Like, for me, moving abroad has been character building, because I've had so many opportunities here. I've had opportunities to move into leadership. I've had opportunities to continue with my DEIJ journey. I've had opportunities just to mix in different circles. We have like Black women in Beijing circles where we also support and empower each other in those kind of communities as well. So like it's done so much for me as well.
And I know, as someone that has visited Thailand, Indonesia, most recently Vietnam, when you're in those spaces as a Black person, you are like a phenomenon, the way they look at you. So I totally get it, where you're coming from.
Yeah. It's funny, my brother visited and he's like 6'5" with dreads
Oh
like
boy.
you. And we went to the Great Wall
Well, I
and
ain't
like
6'5", but thank you though.
well, I was talking about the dreads.
Yeah.
And so, you know, but he loved the attention. But when you're going about your daily life, obviously, you know, it's a bit harder with the attention. But for the most part, you know, this is my second time in Beijing, and I feel that it's less so now. The more the general population is evolving. It's more so now. There's still pockets of these experiences, I'm not going to lie. But equally, there's also, you know, good experience, really positive experiences that I've had with the community. Generally, you know, Chinese people are really kind and caring and supportive. My colleagues, my friends are really kind. And it's just a beautiful culture to be immersed in. It's rich in culture, rich in so many things to do as well. So I do feel very fortunate to be here.
So you talked about how when you first got there, you immediately experienced that communication barrier, not being able to speak Mandarin. So at that moment, you recognize how much of a privilege it is in this context to be able to speak Mandarin. That's a
For
whole
sure,
power dynamic.
for sure.
So I want to talk about those 3 Ps, because I asked about this on
Mm,
almost every episode: privilege,
mm,
power, and positionality.
mm.
I'm curious to know, in your context, professionally and personally, how have those 3 Ps influenced you and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that as an educator, power, privilege, and positionality is like deeply influences my approach to teaching and leadership. For me, privilege is something that I'm constantly reflecting on, especially with my different intersections, and especially in the international school realm, where access to quality education is tied to economic status, your race, your nationality. Acknowledging my own privilege in these spaces is really important as an educator in a global context, especially as someone who also has access to platforms where I can use my voice. You know, I need to be mindful to use my voice in a positive way. And it also allows me to think about the voices that are missing, the voices that are on the margins, and the voices that need to be amplified, the voices that need to be heard as well. So that I'm always mindful of. I think positionality reminds me that my identity as a Black British Nigerian woman shapes how I navigate educational spaces and how I am perceived. My lived experiences really impact the relationships that I build with my students, with my colleagues, and with the wider community. I feel very fortunate to be in a space where I do have a lot of people who look like me. And I am a role model to these students and staff members and parents. You know, I'll be walking around the hallway and so many of our BIPOC parents would, you know, just like stop me and say hello and greet me and share how happy they are to have me in the community, especially as a leader in the school as well. And as for power, I recognize that as an educator, I hold significant influence over the experiences of the students in my care. You know, I really strive to use that power responsibly by fostering inclusive spaces and equitable spaces for these kids. In particular, really taking time to listen to those kids, really taking time to support them, whether it's through culturally responsiveness or finding space to amplify their voice. For me, I strive to use power with techniques rather than power over.
All right. Yeah. And then speaking on being in DEIJ work internationally, the one thing that I've noticed in my time with AIELOC is that you really have to consider the intersectional challenges that come with that. Whereas when I was in the States, a lot of focus was around race and language predominantly. Right? We focus on those identity markers. And then, of course, we do talk about neurodiversity to a certain degree with special education. But you get to that international realm, now it's like, oh, you got to worry about class. You got to worry about socioeconomic status. You have to worry about neurodiversity. You got to worry about even nationality because you're looking at kids who are coming from different walks of life. So as you're looking at these different things that you have to consider and the different places you've worked in internationally, how do you believe you've grown or evolved in your work as a DEIJ leader in those different school contexts?
I do believe that my journey, my evolution and my journey has been shaped by the different settings that I've been in. You know, like you mentioned, I started my journey in a London schools where the experiences were very different. You know, I was in an area of London with underprivileged students, and we lacked resources, and you know, it was quite a homogenous setting. It was mostly students from Bangladeshi communities that we supported, and we taught. And so moving from that to international realm, where we do have a lot of affluent families in this community, still these issues are still prevalent, right? Kids are still kids. They still have all these intersectionality at play with them as well. But I do believe that each place that I've lived in brings its own unique culture, context, and perspective to the table. And everything that we do and I do has to be context relevant. And these experiences have shaped and developed me, because I do have to look at things in a more nuanced way, and with a more global view of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because some of the things that impacted my students from my inner London schools do not impact my students here in Beijing. So it has to be context relevant.
For sure.
I think for me, what some of the things that I've learned as well is to focus on like strategic, like systemic changes within the school community as well. I think when I started, it was mostly about representation, but as time has gone by, my focus has been a lot on advocacy and on student leadership, on empowering student, on amplifying student voices and student agency, because I honestly believe that they are the ones that they are the change makers. They are the ones that are going to make that change for us. And they have so much power in their voice, even especially as young kids.
Yeah, I think that's the shift that has to happen because when we think about DEIJ or DEIB, whatever you call it in your context, work, so much focus is on representation. So in this case, diversity and inclusion. That's the focus. Let's make sure that we have the faces. Let's make sure that we have the visuals so that it appears that we are being inclusive. But the belonging piece is really the key. Because here's the thing, we could all be on the same team, we could all wear the same jersey, but when y'all get into a huddle, am I gonna be a part of that huddle? Am I gonna be able to join that huddle and be a part of that, even though we all got the same jerseys on? So the belonging is where we need to go. And you mentioned the importance of student voice. Student voice is where it's at. And quite honestly, if students are able to have that agency and the power to voice their concerns and to share their experiences to leadership, to the heads, to administrators, that's what's going to agitate the changes that we're pushing to have in our schools.
And essentially, as you know, an advocate, what I do is facilitate those opportunities, right? Because all they need is the opportunity to bring their ideas to leadership, and then have their ideas facilitated so that those changes can be made as well. But I think I also wanted to speak to what you said about belonging, because it's so powerful. My, often school focus on belonging with an emphasis on the motto. They put whatever motto they have on their websites, and they don't actually live it. We really have belonging has to be done with intentionality. Every staff member, every student has to feel affirmed, has to be able to bring themselves, their authentic self, to our school spaces, and that has to be intentionally created. It doesn't just happen, and it's things like also interrupting harm that's happening in our school, interrupting the biases that happen in our school. Those also help to foster belonging. Belonging doesn't just happen. It's with the be us. That's not how belonging happens. It's intentionally cultivated, using the voice of everyone, making sure that people can be themselves, making sure when we have situation of identity-based harm, for example, it's interrupted and people are made accountable for their actions, so that our identities are being affirmed in our spaces. Because when we let those things slide, it makes people feel like they don't matter. Their identity doesn't matter when certain identities are mollycoddled and affirmed, but others are told that intentions are focused on rather than impact that was made.
Right. And the belonging is in the understanding that you have to learn. You have to be willing to learn about what you don't know.
Mm,
You have to be willing to acknowledge that you do not know everything about everyone.
mm.
And that could be any identity marker we can think of.
100%, 100%. And
And
we all
also,
make we
right, right,
all
right.
make mistakes, and it's acknowledging and learning, actually learning why what you said, what you did, the harm that was caused was a harm, and pledging to do better, actively doing better as well.
And do you believe that in doing this work, when you're in that position, getting people to recognize their actions as harmful is the challenging part? Because sometimes there are overt actions that are clearly harmful. There's no debate about it. But sometimes it might be those micro, or should I say macroaggression that people don't see.
Mm,
Is the implicit bias actions that people don't realize, that go under the radar, that are causing the most harm. I
mm.
think that's the hardest part, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think it's both personally. I
Yeah.
agree. I think we need to be more explicit in educating and raising those awareness, um, and holding people accountable to it when they do it, and moving beyond intentions, and focusing on the impact and supporting people who are then harmed in this area as well. I think there's so many layers to it of the work that needs to be done. It's ongoing work. It's relentless. It's hard, but it's needed, because we need people like us. We need, people on the that have been on the margins in our community. Our differences is what enriches us. So that it needs to be there. It needs to be fostered. It needs to be, celebrated and embraced and nurtured.
For sure. So I want to go ahead and switch gears to this next question because it speaks to what you're doing now. So currently at your school, you are a dean of students.
I am.
And this is after being in the classroom for just over a decade, being a classroom teacher. So when you were talking about your work in DEIJ, this was when you were still a full-time teacher taking on these extra roles. Now that you transitioned out of the classroom and you are now in administration, you're in leadership. First off, tell me what prompted you to make that transition, and what have been some of the early differences you've recognized in the first few months?
I think I was definitely motivated by the chance to make meaningful impact at a broader school level. I kind of always wrestled with classroom teaching and my leadership roles on top. It wasn't sustainable. There wasn't balance there. And, you know, we all know that DEIJ work takes a toll on BIPOC and people with, you know, marginalized identities. And so I felt that, you know, I would make a bigger impact outside of the classroom. I'm fortunate that my role also allows me to heavily interact with students. And so, yeah, that was what prompted me to make that move. What was the second part of your question?
The second part of the question was, what are some of the early differences you've recognized in your first few months in administration?
I am so secure as a teacher and an educator. Like, you know, I'm really quite firm in my practice. You know, I've spent a lot of time really working on my practice. I feel like with the identity I have, I don't have any choice. I don't get to be mediocre. And so I've worked really, really hard to get to a place where I was very, very strong at what I do. And so, you know, having to manage my time outside of the classroom, I'm now navigating those kind of things because my work is quite dynamic, it's varied. You know, I go between, like, you know, doing restorative justice chats with students, to leading assemblies, to facilitating student leadership, to, you know, building workshops and supporting teaching assistants and supporting teachers. So it's a lot of balls to juggle. And so I'm still navigating all of those things, navigating how to manage my time. And then also navigating that balance piece because, you know, the school day, you have your lessons timetabled, you have your lunch time, you know, you have and you know, we're fortunate as like international educators to also get lots of planning. But, you know, as a leader, you know, there's a lot more time management in place that I really had to think about, and a lot more, I feel right now, a lot more balls that I'm juggling. So I'm still navigating that at these early stages.
Yeah, for sure. And I was going to ask this, and you could feel free to say no comment, because I want to make sure that people still have a job at the end of the day. I don't want to be the podcast where heads of schools and other people are listening. They're like, oh, nah, that's how they talking about us? Okay.
Oh, that sounds ominous now.
I have to ask, and you could just give maybe a Cliff Notes version in your response. So, being that you're now in administration as a Black woman, knowing the difficulties that come with being a Black woman, forget it, international schools, but just in our global society, how do you believe you've been received? Or let me ask this: do you believe that it's harder to have people trust you in that position? Do you feel like that's something that's a challenge for certain teachers, given who you are?
I think my identity definitely takes a part, whether people want to admit it or not. I felt that way as a classroom teacher. I think my identity in education plays a huge role. I feel fortunate that like I was received quite well at this new space. Um, but equally, there are experiences where I know that given it's because of my identity that I've experienced certain things that I've experienced, but that's in every space that I've been in, you know, and people will never admit that things are, you know, situations have arisen because of biases, but it's obvious. But
Or
equally, I know that there is power in having people like me in these spaces, not only for representation, but because of what we bring to these spaces, because of the wealth of experience, because of the wealth of knowledge, because of, you know, our differences and how we enrich, you know, we enrich the culture of these spaces for those kids as well as the adults.
yeah, for sure. And thank you for sharing that, because I've had a lot of Black women
Mm,
leaders on this
mm,
podcast. And even over the past year, I've had Black women leaders in international education on this
mm,
platform sharing
mm.
some of the trials and tribulations that come with being in that position.
Yeah.
And
And one of the things that I'm feeling, you know, is very important is to have not necessarily in my well, I'm fortunate to have people that look like me in my school that are women. There are powerful, amazing women that I can go to, but also community is important to me, because it does affirm, you know, people will have you believing that what you've just experienced is not really real. And so it's important to have people who, you know, really, really hear you and really, really, you know, hear your reflections, support you, help you navigate spaces, help you navigate situation, and help you move forward as well, because there's a lot of healing and a lot of there's a lot of work that goes into it. It's heavy.
it's very heavy. And wow, this has just been a really good conversation. And we could keep going for another hour if we could, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to go ahead and wrap things up with this final question. It's a question that I ask all my guests. You know what's coming. How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
For me, especially now moving out of the classroom, it's very much about centering my core values, and that is nurturing, empowering, and advocating for students. I stay grounded in that purpose. I believe that when students are at the heart of our decision making, we can't go wrong. And so for me in this role, I make sure that I create spaces where students can be seen and valued. And I make it intentional to be very present and actively listening to our students and actively supporting our students. I make sure that I'm all around the school, really like present with the kids. So I've only been at my new school for something like 9 weeks, and I made an intentional act to go into every single class and do sessions in those classrooms. Last week, I accompanied our senior school kids to South Korea to an empowering event on DEIJ, providing them with support and encouragement. This week, I went on a trip with our 3-year-olds to the fire station. I've done read aloud in kindergarten. I'm leading student council. I'm, you know, in front of assembly. It's, you know, you have to, you know, for me, I believe in education. Even if you're an admin, you have to really immerse yourself with the people we are serving, and that's the students, you know.
And that's going to be your calling card. That's what's going to lead to the success that I know you're going to have, that you're already having. You've been
Thank
in
you.
the trenches. You know what it's like to work. You know what it's like to be in the classroom. And you've been through your own share of situations, which will not divulge. That's between you. But you're here. You've
100%.
persevered. You are here with me. And I couldn't be more thankful that you allowed IDTALK4ED Educators Live to be the first platform where you do an interview.
Yay! I'm so proud of myself. I felt the fear and I did it anyway.
That's what I'm talking about. Listen, I don't know how somebody who has a fear of presenting ends up teaching for over 10 years and is now in administration, where you're going to have to do even more presenting. You're doing something right.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're doing
Thank you.
something right.
It's just lovely to have an amazing community. Honestly, AIELOC has been life-changing for me. The incredible people that I have in my community that affirm, that support, that coach, that, counsel, I really feel that those are the things that have really helped me to improve, to reflect, to keep doing what I'm doing. So I'm super grateful for an incredible community as well.
And since we're talking about AIELOC, you should thank Nayung, because this was really her idea. She came to me and was like, Kwame, you should interview Iyabo for your podcast. And whenever Nayung makes a suggestion, I really give it a lot of thought.
Oh,
And I'm like,
Nyong
you
is
know
such a
what?
human.
Yeah, I
I
think I
think she's come
should.
into our lives for so many amazing reasons.
Yes.
Our lives collided in Singapore. We spent time together in Germany at the same school. Like, who knew that was going to happen? And that's like the power of international teaching as well. And just making lifelong friends, colleagues, people that, you can bounce ideas off of, be sounding boards. It's just so incredible. It's so impactful. Just feel so much gratitude.
And shout out to Nayung Kim Weaver. She is a wonderful human being. She's actually been on my other podcast, Radical Math Talk, but I might have to bring her back onto this platform so
Absolutely.
y'all can learn her story. And she is someone who likes to be behind the scenes. She doesn't really like the attention like that, so it'll take some convincing. But I figure she'll come on here one day.
I think she
But
will.
I
We'll
think
come.
so too. Yeah. But getting back to you, Iyabo, once again, thank you so much for coming on. And I know you're not super active online, but for those that do want to connect with you just to learn about your work and how to be a leader in an international school, being a Black woman, having the identity that you have, can they connect with you so they can build?
So I'm trying to exercise a bit of balance right now. I'm off the socials, trying to really focus on self-care and well-being, but I'm always on LinkedIn. So add me on LinkedIn.
There you go, y'all. And I love it. Boundaries. And I hope that you make sure that you keep those boundaries in
Yes,
your new
it's been
position, because
life-changing.
you're already doing a whole lot.
Thank you so
Just
much.
remember to make sure you prioritize yourself in the process.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm like, this has been amazing. Thank
Yes.
you for letting me share my story.
Yeah, well, thank you for being vulnerable enough to share, because not everybody wants to be that open to a bunch of strangers who are listening and watching. So I appreciate you having the courage to do that. And on behalf of Iyabo, I thank you all for watching or listening to another episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, and good night wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.
Bye-bye.